Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach F1 channel, and in today's video, as you can see by the title, we are going to be talking about the strategies that you can use for the chips. I'm also going to be explaining in this video how each chip works as well. But before we get into all of that good stuff, please make sure to like and subscribe. Follow me on Twitter for any more updates just on the channel and on F1 Fantasy in general. And if you want, join my F1 Fantasy League. The last time I checked, we had around 550 people in it, which is just insane to me, 550 people. I'm hoping to get up to 750 by the end of the year, but that is a big task. But anyway, with all of that out of the way, let's jump straight into this video. Now, the first thing that needs to be talked about is the deadlines for the teams. Now, we've seen in the last sprint race weekend and in Miami, it's going to be the same thing, where in sprint qualifying, it's before the team lock. For me, this is very much sort of a cheat code. It wasn't as much as a cheat code in China because there was a bit of rain drizzled in there. However, I think it's quite overpowered. Plus, yes, you don't get any points from sprint qualifying, so it's no mistake from F1 Fantasy themselves. However, I do think there is potential for it to be changed going further ahead into the season. And you'll start to notice a trend in these paths that you can take for the strategies where I choose earlier races on in the season. And it's specifically for this reason, mainly because it's a little bit of a worry knowing that if you try limitlessing, say in Brazil, in the later stages of the season, if they get rid of being able to see what's happening in sprint qualifying before the team lock, then it's a little bit less overpowered. And with that out of the way, we'll start off with the chips in general. So this is Zach's guide to each and every chip. So we'll start off with Limitless. And like it says in the name, it basically means you have no limits. Well, there are still some limits applied, but in terms of team value, you have unlimited team values for the singular weekend, and that means you can bring the likes of Verstappen, Norris, Perez, Red Bull, Ferrari, Leclerc, Sainz, all the big drivers, even Alonso if you wanted to get rid of one of them, and have them all in the same team. Now, there are a few things you need to know about Limitless going forward, and this is that your team will reset after Limitless to your previous Grand Prix team selection. So you can't be cheeky doing 2 or 3 transfers before using Limitless in the same Grand Prix and think, oh, you know what? I'm going to get them in for the next race. I'll Limitless and then have them ready. No, you will automatically go back to your team selection. So anyone who used it in China this last Grand Prix weekend, they will all have their Japanese teams available to them. Plus, if you had 3 free transfers saved up, you will revert back to the normal 2 free transfers. So you can't roll transfers either when doing Limitless. And the final thing you need to keep an eye on when doing Limitless is that your team value will not change with your Limitless teams. Once your Limitless team has been used, it can only be used for points. Your team will revert, like I've said, and will pick up the team value that your old team would have had. So then the next chip on our radar would be the Wildcard. And this is where things start to get a little bit wild. Oh god, I hate myself. So on a normal weekend, you'd normally only have 2 transfers if you haven't rolled over a free transfer, or potentially 3 free transfers. However, when you wildcard, those limits do not apply to you. You have unlimited free transfers to your team before the team deadline. So that means if you have to make 4 or 5 different changes to your team, this is when you would use a wildcard. However, again, there are a few things you need to be careful with when using the wildcard. First of all, your team will not revert. It's not one of the chips that you use for one weekend and then you get your old team back. No, this team will be with you for however long you have it until you yourself make the changes to your team. And again, like all chips that will be and have been mentioned in this video, you can only use this once in the season. We then move on to, I think, one of the most interesting chips that is around at the minute, and that is the final fix chip. And that's because there actually is quite a lot of strategy behind what you can use with it, but also it's quite a detailed chip to be using. So say you're an unlucky son of a bitch and one of your cheap drivers actually has a good qualifying, which funnily enough is probably worse in F1 Fantasy. Like we saw with Bottas and Hulkenberg this weekend, some of the fewest scoring drivers, even without Bottas's -20, and that's because they just lost positions and fell down the grid, which the other drivers who started last or closer to last didn't have that issue. Now, the way Final Fix actually works itself is you will keep the points that your drivers have given you, let's say for quali, in the qualifying session that you had them. So say you had Bottas when he came 9th, you would get 2 points, and then when you used Final Fix in the race, you would have whoever you changed out. Now, again, like each and every chip, there are a few details that you really need to know before using them. First one is, if you use it on a sprint weekend, you will keep the points for anyone that you've had in sessions. This goes for the sprint race and the qualifying. However, if you use Final Fix before the race, which yes, in each and every race, even if it's a sprint race weekend, the deadline is the race for the Final Fix, the actual race. Then let's say you had Tsunoda in the sprint race. He did too good in qualifying and you think he's going to drop down. You take his points, Final Fix him to someone else, and then get someone else to get you more points in the race. Now, again, it is a one race option, so your team will revert back to what it was before you did the changes for the Final Fix. Again, like usual with like the Limitless, that means your team value will be of the drivers you had before. Let's take Yuki Tsunoda again. If you had Yuki Tsunoda and he went down 0.1 million, but the driver you brought in went up 0.5 million, you would still get Yuki Tsunoda's 0.1 million. You cannot change your constructors with Final Fix. It's very much only drivers for this chip. And the final thing is, if you get rid of your 2 times driver on Final Fix, you cannot change it around. It will go on to the driver that gets put in the slot where the 2 times used to be. So you have to be careful if you change a 2 times driver. Now, with autopilot, this one is quite simple. It is basically where you will put 2 times on one of the drivers you own, and if someone else does better in your team, driver-wise, then the autopilot will automatically move the 2 times to someone else. There are no strings attached to it, really. Probably the most simple chip out there to use. However, it's probably the most useless chip as well, especially considering what most people's teams look like this season. But hey-ho, let's move on to no negative. Again, what it does is in its name. You cannot score any negative points. Now, a lot of people would only see this as DNF points. However, this means everything. So you can get negative points for being disqualified, getting a DNF, for constructors not getting anyone into Q2, for no time set in qualifying, and for positions lost in races. So that means all of those points you physically cannot get while using no negative. That is why it's such a useful chip. I actually used mine in China and actually saved around 50 points. I would have got around 300 odd points. I got 359 instead. It's a very useful chip. Again, one that you'll probably want to put down for sprint weekends, but I'll talk about that later. Again, no negative only lasts for 1 race. And if your team does badly without the no negative, yes, you won't get the points. However, you will still get the bad team value changes. And then we move on to the final chip that is in F1 Fantasy, and that is the extra DRS. And this one is quite an interesting one. This is where you have 2 times, like usual, in your team to put on any driver you want. However, you have an extra 3 times to put on a driver. Again, you cannot put either of these on constructors. But the way it works is, for instance, if you have Verstappen and Perez in your team, you could 2 times Perez and 3 times Verstappen to maximize your output of points. And again, this chip only lasts for 1 week. So now that you know fully how the chips work and each of their drawbacks and their pros, let's talk about the paths you can take while doing the chip strategies. Now, path 1 is the strategy for anyone who has already Limitless. Say you did it in China, or say you did it even before the first sprint race in China. So the next step on your journey will be to Wildcard if you have it, or get those transfers in as quickly as possible to the Max Verstappen team for Miami. You need to get off that budget building team and move to Verstappen as quickly as possible, as you'll get the most points and it sets you up for the next chips you can use. And the next chip you will use with this strategy, where you've already used Limitless, would be 2 extra DRS in Austria. Now, extra DRS is going to be slightly difficult to get to, and I'll show you what your team sort of has to look like to use extra DRS to get the most out of your team. You can see it's Verstappen, Perez with 3 cheap drivers, Red Bull and Haas. Now, it's a hard team to get to. That's why you're going to need 3 races to change your team over and back to your original. However, it's not as bad as it sounds. 1 week before using the extra DRS, you will have to make sure you have the cheapest drivers possible. So you'll have to take 1 week where you'll probably have the likes of Zhou, Bottas and Sargent. Then in the next week, you'll have 2 extra free transfers where you get rid of your second driver, bring in Perez, drop Ferrari down to a Haas. Your team is complete, and then you extra DRS. Then coming out of this weekend, you are going to need to transfer again Perez and Haas out again for Ferrari and for whoever you had in that second driver position, maybe Tsunoda, maybe Magnussen, maybe someone else. And then the final weekend again is getting rid of those cheap drivers. And that's how it will work for the extra DRS. And this will all revolve around Austria, as this is the sprint race weekend where you will get the most points out of your extra DRS. Again, I've put it so early on in the season, just in case they do change the rules to have sprint qualifying be the deadline, because we want to get the most out of it. And say, for instance, Perez doesn't look as good, then we could easily bring in someone else if we know that after sprint qualifying. I would like to add that it is possible to wait with the wild card until after using the extra DRS to get your team right back to normal. However, I feel like it's better to wild card in the Verstappen team, and if you're desperate to fully get back to your same team the same weekend after the extra DRS, then take the -10 afterwards, as it is just so incredibly important at this stage of the season to have the Verstappen team. Then after this, we have to talk about the no negative, which will be used in path 1. Now, if you don't have no negative, it doesn't matter. You can still use this same path for your F1 season. However, no negative, like I've said, has to be used at a sprint race weekend. Now, no negative doesn't matter too much if the sprint qualifying is the deadline or not. So I would recommend waiting until Brazil to use no negative, as it can be quite a chaotic race with quite a few crashes, and it's better to be safe than sorry if you still have the no negative available to you at that point in the season. Then we move on to final fix. It doesn't really have a place in the timeline, and that's because it's one of the chips where I would say it's not actually better or worse to use at a sprint weekend or a normal race, because it's so team dependent. All I would say is whenever you have a race like in China, for instance, where you have Hülkenberg and Bottas who have done really well in qualifying, take away their sprint race negatives for this example, where you would come out of that with 2 points from Bottas and 3 points from Hülkenberg. You could then final fix them two to a Magnussen and Zhou, who did much worse in qualifying. However, you know they're going to get more overtake points. And so you would get the good qualifying bonuses from Hülkenberg and Bottas, and also get the good F1 Fantasy overtake points and position gained points from Magnussen and Zhou in the race. And that's how you have to use this chip. However, it very much varies on the team and what happens in qualifying. And that's why you can use it at any race. However, I would say once you see 1 or 2 of your cheap drivers do well in qualifying, but you know they're going to drop back down, that's when you should use Final Fix 100%. And then you'll notice I haven't actually talked about autopilot, and that's because it's pretty useless this season. Not many teams that you're going to want do have multiple good drivers, and even still, there is such a big threshold to Verstappen and Perez, or Verstappen, Norris, Verstappen, Leclerc, Verstappen, Sainz, whoever you think the second best driver is for F1 Fantasy points, that it would be worth using the autopilot. Yes, you should still use it. However, in my opinion, just stick it on in one of the sprint races where you don't have another chip on. And just, if Verstappen gets a DNF, then you've got very lucky and you get an extra few points where you would have not got that. And that is a very good strategy going forward for your chips. Again, like I said, you can still follow this path if you use Limitless, no negative, final fix. The main one you need to still have for this path is the extra DRS. But of course, if you don't have all of these chips for the path, but it still makes sense to use this path, treat it more as guidelines. Now, path 2 is quite similar to path 1, however, it varies slightly, and that different variation is Limitless still being available. So instead of using the wildcard in Miami, I would recommend Limitlessing in Miami instead. And this is because of, again, we don't know if they're going to change the team deadlines, potentially, and it's such a cheat code at the minute. Miami is a very safe option to use Limitless on, as there's not many chaotic races at Miami. And also, it will set you up for the next chips that you need to start getting prepared for. Again, After Limitlessing in Miami, you will either wildcard over to the Verstappen team if you do not have it yet in Imola, or you will stick with the Verstappen teams going ahead into Imola. Now, this is where Path 1 and Path 2 collide, because extra DRS will be again used in Austria, and you will want to go for the same strategy, with using it over 3 races where you bring in the cheaper drivers, then you bring in Perez and Haas over your second driver and Ferrari, then you revert Perez and Haas back to Ferrari and your second driver, and then deal with your cheap drivers after that. And that is because this is the best way to deal with extra DRS. Again, with the final fix, it varies team to team, but again, good qualifying, taking those points, bring in people who've had bad qualifying, they're going to get better overtakes and position gained points. And then finally, again, like Path 1, you should use the no negative in Brazil. It's the most chaotic sprint race on the grid, and by that point of the season, the development of all cars, we could be seeing a lot more overtakes, a lot more racing by the end of the season, which could cause more crashes. Now, for pathway 3, which is the alternate pathway, this is how you would take this. If you still have wildcard, bring in Max Verstappen for Miami. You would then use Limitless in Austria, as Austria tends to have a lot of overtaking, and more overtaking could lead to more points for your Limitless. Again, no negative in Brazil, as this is the most logical place to use it if you still have the no negative. Now, for extra DRS on this alternate pathway, the thing that you could do is actually keeping with your normal team, with Verstappen, Red Bull and Ferrari, and let's say someone like Magnussen or Tsunoda as your second driver. Now, what you would do is just keep them as the 2-times driver. It's a lot less complicated, and you could use this strategy at any sprint race weekend. I would preferably use it in Kota for this pathway. However, for the other pathways, you could easily use it in Austria, as you don't have to do this free weekend setup and getting back to your original team, and it only scores you around 10 to 20 points less. So it could be worth doing this extra DRS strategy as well. However, those are all the strategies I would use for your chips for the upcoming season. Now, again, like I've said, they're sort of guidelines. If you've already used a few chips that I've talked about in places where now you can't use them, don't worry too much and just follow the structure of the path. But anyway, what do you guys think of the strategies in this video? What are you guys going to do? And do you have any other strategies that maybe you could use for the chips? But anyway, I'll see you all on Friday for an F1 video. Have a great rest of your week, and bye-bye.